I remember the exact sound the last chain made when it tightened around that SUV's axle. A sharp metallic snap that echoed through the cul-de-sac like something final. And by sunrise, every single car in that HOA was gone. 48 hours earlier, I was standing barefoot on what used to be my private road, the heat of fresh asphalt bleeding through the soles of my boots, the smell thick and chemical in the morning air, diesel engines idling like they owned the place, and I just stood there, tasting dust and disbelief as a construction crew rolled over $80,000 of gravel, drainage, and grading I had paid for out of my own pocket. My name is Ethan Cole, and that strip of road wasn't just convenience. It was the entire reason I bought the property, a narrow half-mile access cut through Texas clay that I designed myself to stay outside HOA control, every inch surveyed, every permit filed, every dollar earned the hard way. 6 months of work, crushed into a smooth black ribbon overnight like it never belonged to me in the first place. I heard her before I saw her, that soft electric hum of a golf cart creeping up behind me, followed by the faint cloud of perfume that always hit a second before her voice did. "We upgraded it," Vivian Ashcroft said, sweet as syrup and twice as thick, like she was doing me a favor, like she hadn't just erased something I built with my own hands. I turned, slow, feeling the grit grind between my teeth, and there she was in her pressed white outfit, sunglasses catching the sun, standing there like she'd just cut a ribbon on a public project. Behind her, a brand new sign had already been planted at the entrance, bright reflective letters that read Community Access Road, bold enough to make it official, bold enough to make people forget what it used to be. I didn't say anything, not yet, just listened to the low rumble of machinery finishing up, the hiss of cooling tar, the crunch of gravel that used to belong to me now, buried under something permanent. "It increases property value for everyone," she added, folding her arms like that settled it. Like ownership was just a suggestion if enough people agreed to ignore it. I nodded once, slow, letting the silence stretch, because I'd learned something a long time ago. People like Vivian always talk more when you don't interrupt them. They explain, justify, expose everything they think you don't understand. What she didn't know, what none of them knew as they started driving over that road later that day like it had always been theirs, was that nothing about that land had changed except the surface. The paperwork didn't change, the deed didn't change, and the one clause buried deep in the original filing, the one nobody reads until it's too late, that didn't change either. I stood there until the last truck rolled out, until the engines faded and the neighborhood settled back into its artificial quiet, and I could still feel the heat rising off that asphalt, still smell the chemicals hanging in the air, and that's when I finally turned and walked back toward my house, already running numbers in my head, already thinking about timing, contracts, and leverage, because they thought they had taken my road overnight. But what they really did was give me something far more valuable, proof that they were all using something that still legally belonged to me. I did not call a lawyer that day, not yet, because the law does not reward panic, it rewards timing. And timing starts with understanding exactly what people think they have gotten away with. By noon the road was already busy, tires humming over fresh asphalt like it had always been there. Neighbors I had never spoken to cruising in and out without a second thought, their SUVs and pickup trucks leaving faint rubber whispers on a surface that still radiated heat under the Texas sun. I stood by my mailbox, arms crossed, watching patterns form, counting without looking like I was counting, 1 car, 3, 7, 12, all of them treating my property like it had been signed over in some meeting I was never invited to. The new sign caught the light every time a vehicle passed. Community Access Road, clean edges, bolted into the ground where my old private marker used to stand. And I could still see the faint outline in the dirt where my sign had been pulled out, like a scar that had not decided what it wanted to be yet. Vivian did not come back. She did not need to. Her work was already done in her mind, and people like her always move on the moment. They think control is permanent. That was my first advantage. I went inside, closed the door, and the quiet hit different, like the house was waiting for me to do something about it. I pulled the original deed from the drawer, the paper thick and slightly yellowed at the edges, the kind of document that carries weight without raising its voice, and I laid it flat on the table, smoothing it out with both hands, reading every line like I had not already memorized it years ago. The clause was still there, Buried halfway down page 3 in language so dry most people would skip it entirely. Private access easement retained exclusively by owner. No public right-of-way granted under any modification without written consent. I let that sentence sit in my head for a minute, repeating it silently, while outside another engine rolled past like it belonged. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up county records, permits, surveys, everything tied to that strip of land. Each file loading with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the still room. Nothing had changed, no transfer, no amendment, no agreement filed, which meant what they built on top did not rewrite what existed underneath. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the distant hum of traffic on my road. And that was when the second piece clicked into place, not legal, not emotional, but practical. Years ago, when I developed a commercial lot outside Dallas, I had signed a towing enforcement contract. Standard clause for private access control, the kind of agreement you forget about until you need it. And I still had a copy. I could almost hear the operator's voice in my head, calm, businesslike, explaining the conditions under which a vehicle could be removed from private property without warning. I did not rush. I did not pick up the phone right away. Instead, I walked back outside, stood at the edge of the asphalt, and watched another car glide over it, sunlight flashing across the windshield, driver not even slowing down. 58, I thought, not as a guess, but as a number I was going to verify, because details matter when you plan something that has to be precise. I took a slow breath, the air still carrying that faint burnt smell, and for the first time since the machines showed up, I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not frustration, just clarity, because they thought they had turned my road into a convenience, and all I had to do now was remind them that convenience can be taken away just as quietly as it appears. I started documenting everything the moment the sun dipped low enough to throw long shadows across that asphalt, because memory is unreliable, but timestamps are not. And by 6:30 that evening, I had a clean log of every vehicle that crossed that road. Make, model, color, license plate when I could get it. The soft click of my camera shutter barely audible over the steady hum of engines and the occasional crunch where the asphalt had not fully settled. It was almost peaceful if you ignored what it meant. Neighbors waving at each other, kids riding bikes along the edge like it had always been a shared space, tires rolling smooth over something that still technically answered to my name. I leaned against the fence line and watched them use it, not with anger anymore, but with focus, counting again, confirming the number I had in my head, 58 vehicles tied to that HOA. Some parked along the curb where my gravel shoulder used to be, others tucked into driveways that branched off like veins from something they assumed was permanent. The air had cooled, but the road still held warmth, releasing that faint chemical scent every time a car passed, like it was reminding me it had been changed but not transferred. Around 7:15 Vivian reappeared, not in a hurry, never in a hurry, her golf cart gliding over my road with that same quiet confidence, and she slowed just enough to look at me, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, like she was checking for resistance and finding none. "Looks better this way," she said, casual, almost conversational, like we were discussing landscaping instead of ownership. I gave her a nod, nothing more, and that was exactly what she expected, compliance dressed up as silence. She drove off, satisfied, and that was the moment I knew the window was open, because when people stop defending what they have done, it means they believe it cannot be challenged. I went back inside as the light faded, the house settling into that evening quiet again, and I spread out everything on the table, the deed, the survey map, the old towing contract I had dug out earlier, its pages crisp from disuse, but still valid, still binding. I traced the property line with my finger, following the exact path of that road from the county line to my front gate, every inch documented, every boundary clear. And I could almost overlay the image of those 58 vehicles sitting on top of it like they belonged there. I picked up my phone then, finally, the screen cool, against my hand, and scrolled to a number I had not used in years, a towing operator who specialized in commercial enforcement, the kind of guy who did not ask questions as long as the paperwork was clean. I did not call yet, not until I had one more piece confirmed. So I opened my email and drafted a notice, formal language, precise wording, private property enforcement effective immediately, unauthorized vehicle subject to removal without warning, and I scheduled it to send at a time when it would exist legally but be seen too late to matter. Outside, the last few cars rolled in for the night, engines cutting off one by one until the neighborhood fell into that artificial silence again, and I stood by the window watching the stillness settle over everything they thought they owned, knowing that by the next sunrise, the only thing left on that road would be the realization that they had been parked in the wrong place all along. The email went out at exactly 9:12 that night, quiet and official, buried just deep enough in their inboxes to exist without being noticed, and I could almost picture it sitting there unopened while the neighborhood settled into sleep, porch lights flicking off one by one, engines ticking as they cooled, the faint smell of asphalt finally fading into the background. I did not need them to read it. I just needed it to be there, time-stamped, documented, another line in a chain that would hold when it mattered. Inside, the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft tap of my fingers against the table as I reviewed everything one more time, not because I doubted it, but because precision is what separates a reaction from a result. I checked the towing agreement again, the language clear and unambiguous, private. Property enforcement authorized, vehicle subject to removal without prior notice when in violation, and I matched it line by line with the deed clause, the boundaries, the survey coordinates that traced that road like a signature across the land. Every piece fit, every angle covered, and that calm feeling settled deeper, the kind that does not spike your pulse but steadies it. Around 10:30, I stepped outside again. The night air cooler now, carrying a faint mix of cut grass and lingering tar, and the road lay quiet under the streetlights, smooth and dark, lined with cars that reflected soft yellow glows across their windshields. 58. I counted again, slower this time, confirming positions, spacing, access points, the way some were angled, the way others hugged the curb, details that would matter later when timing had to be exact. A truck door slammed somewhere down the line, followed by a muffled laugh. Normal life playing out on top of something that was about to shift. I walked the length of the road once, boots tapping lightly against the new surface, feeling the difference under each step, and stopped at the entrance where that bright sign stood, Community Access Road, clean and confident under the light, like it had authority. I reached out and ran my fingers along the metal edge, cool now, no longer carrying the heat of the day, and for a second I let the silence stretch, the kind that holds just before something changes. Then I turned back toward the house, pulled my phone from my pocket, and finally made the call. The line clicked once before a familiar voice answered, steady, professional, the kind that had done this 1,000 times. I gave my name, the property details, the coordinates, and then I paused just long enough to make sure every word landed exactly where it needed to. Private access enforcement, full authorization, multiple vehicles in violation. I said it calmly, like I was ordering a service instead of setting something in motion. There was no hesitation on the other end, just a short confirmation, a time window, and the sound of keys tapping in the background as it was logged. 3 o'clock, he said, and I could almost hear the weight of that time settle into place. I ended the call and stood there for a moment longer, looking down that road lined with quiet, unmoving cars, each one parked with the assumption that morning would look exactly like this. The air felt still, almost too still, and I took a slow breath, letting it fill my chest, letting everything lock into place, because by the time the sun came up again, the only thing left on that stretch of asphalt would be empty space and a lesson none of them saw coming. At exactly 2:57 in the morning, I was already awake, sitting in the dark with nothing but the faint glow of the kitchen clock and the distant hum of the neighborhood, sleeping like it had nothing to worry about. And for a moment, everything felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath before something shifted. The asphalt outside had cooled completely now, no more heat waves rising off it, just a smooth black surface under pale streetlights with 58 cars resting quietly on top of it, lined up in driveways and along the curb, silent and certain they would still be there in a few hours. Then I heard it, faint at first, a low diesel rumble rolling in from the distance, steady and deliberate, not loud enough to wake anyone, but impossible to ignore once you knew what it meant. I stood up, walked to the window, and watched as the first set of amber lights turned the corner, reflecting off windshields and soft flickers that moved like signals across the street. One truck, then another, each one easing into position with the kind of precision that comes from doing the same job night after night. The sound of hydraulic lifts engaging cut through the quiet. A metallic whine followed by the solid click of chains tightening, controlled and efficient. No chaos, no rush, just process. I stepped outside, the cool air carrying the smell of diesel and cold metal, and leaned lightly against the fence as it unfolded exactly the way I had planned. Operators moved calmly from vehicle to vehicle, checking plates against the list I had provided, confirming positions, working in a rhythm that did not need words. A sedan lifted cleanly, its suspension settling as it was secured, then rolled back slowly, tires leaving that road for the last time without resistance. Across the street, another truck hooked a pickup, the chain sliding into place with a sharp, final sound that echoed just enough to mark the moment. Windows in nearby houses stayed dark, no lights flipping on, no doors opening, because everything was happening just quietly enough to stay beneath the threshold of attention. One by one, the spaces began to open up, gaps forming where cars had been minutes before, the road revealing itself again in long stretches of uninterrupted black. I checked my watch without thinking, noting the timing, the pace, the sequence, because this was not just removal. It was execution, every step aligning with the plan down to the minute. The faint scrape of a tow arm adjusting, the soft hiss of air brakes releasing, the low murmur of engines idling between movements, all of it blending into a controlled operation that felt almost surgical. By 3:40, more than half of them were gone, the street already looking unfamiliar, stripped of the clutter that had appeared so confidently just hours earlier. I took a slow breath, the air cool and steady in my chest, and watched as another SUV was lifted and guided away, its reflection disappearing from the asphalt like it had never been there at all. There was no shouting, no confrontation, just the quiet removal of something that did not belong. And as the last few vehicles were secured, the road stretched out clean and empty under the streetlights, smooth, silent, and finally unmistakable for what it had always been. The last truck rolled out just before 4:15, its taillights fading down the road until the darkness swallowed them completely. And when the engine noise finally disappeared, the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before it. I stood there for a few more seconds, hands in my pockets, looking down a stretch of asphalt that no longer looked like theirs, no longer felt shared, just a clean, uninterrupted line of black under dim streetlights with empty space on both sides where certainty used to sit. The air was cool and still, carrying only a faint trace of diesel that was already starting to fade. And for the first time since this started, everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. I walked the length of the road slowly, boots tapping softly against the surface, each step echoing just enough to remind me how quiet it had become, and I stopped again at that sign, Community Access Road, still standing there like nothing had changed, like the message still held weight. I reached up, adjusted it slightly, straightened it so it faced perfectly down an empty path, and left it there. Because sometimes the most effective statement is letting something stay long enough for people to realize it no longer means what they thought it did. By the time I got back inside, the sky was just beginning to lighten at the edges, that early gray blue that shows up before anyone is fully awake, and I poured a cup of coffee, the smell rich and familiar, cutting through the last traces of asphalt that had clung to everything for the past 2 days. I sat by the window again, same spot as before, and waited. It did not take long. The first porch light flicked on at 5:37, a soft glow spilling across a driveway that no longer had a vehicle in it, followed by a pause. Then another light, then another, like a chain reaction of confusion moving through the neighborhood. A door opened, then another, the sound of footsteps on concrete, voices low at first, questioning, then sharper as realization started to spread. I could not hear every word, but I did not need to. The tone said enough. Disbelief turning into urgency. Urgency turning into frustration as people walked out to spaces that no longer held what they expected. One man stood in the middle of the road, turning slowly as if the answer might be behind him. Another checked his phone, pacing in tight circles, the glow of the screen lighting up his face in quick flashes. More doors opened, more voices joined, and the quiet order of the night dissolved into a scattered, restless energy that moved from house to house. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the heat settle, and watched as patterns shifted, as certainty gave way to questions nobody had considered asking before, and right on time, like it was part of the same sequence. I saw Vivian step out onto her driveway, posture straight, expression already tightening as she took in the empty space in front of her, her gaze snapping down the length of the road, as if expecting an explanation to present itself. But the road offered nothing, just smooth asphalt, clean lines, and the kind of silence that does not argue, does not explain, it simply exists, waiting for someone to finally understand what it means. The moment she realized it, you could see it in the way her posture changed, not dramatic, not loud, just a subtle shift, like something inside her recalculated and did not like the result. And then she started walking, fast at first, heels striking the pavement with sharp, controlled steps as she moved down the road, scanning left and right like the answer might be parked just out of sight. More doors opened behind her, neighbors stepping out with phones in hand, voices rising now, overlapping, each person trying to make sense of the same empty spaces, the same missing certainty. I stayed by the window for another minute, finishing my coffee, letting the scene build without me in it, because timing does not stop once a plan is executed, it carries through the aftermath. When I stepped outside, the air had warmed slightly, carrying that mix of morning grass and faint asphalt, and the road looked exactly as it had an hour ago. Clean, quiet, undeniable. Vivian spotted me almost immediately, her head turning sharply, eyes locking in like she had just found the only variable she could control. "Ethan," she called, voice tight but measured, the kind of tone people use when they are trying to stay in charge of something that is already slipping. I walked toward her at an even pace, no rush, no hesitation, hands relaxed at my sides, and stopped a few feet away. The space between us filled with everything she was starting to understand. "Where are the cars?" she said, not asking so much as demanding, her gaze flicking past me down the length of the road again, as if it might answer her this time. I tilted my head slightly, letting a second pass before responding, because silence has weight when you use it right. "They were parked on private property," I said, calm, steady, like it was the simplest explanation in the world. A few neighbors had gathered closer now, their conversations dropping just enough to listen, the air tightening with attention. "This is a community road," she snapped back, quicker now, the control thinning at the edges, her hand gesturing toward the sign as if pointing at it would make it true. I followed her motion with my eyes, glanced at the sign, then back at her, and shook my head once. "The surface changed," I said. "The ownership did not." That line hung there for a second, heavier than it sounded, and you could see it land, not just with her, but with the people around us. The shift from assumption to doubt moving quietly through the group. One man stepped forward, phone in hand, asking where he was supposed to get his truck back. Another woman muttering about towing companies and legality, voices stacking again, searching for something solid to grab onto. Vivian's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she tried to push past the answer she did not want. "You cannot just remove vehicles like that," she said, slower now, more deliberate, like choosing her words carefully would change the outcome. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a folded copy of the notice, and held it out, the paper crisp, the print clear, time-stamped, official, and for a moment she did not take it, just looked at it like it might disappear if she ignored it long enough. "It was sent last night," I said. "Enforcement began at 3. She took it then, quick, scanning the lines, her expression tightening further with each word, and around us the noise kept building, confusion turning into frustration as people realized this was not a mistake, not a glitch, but something deliberate, something planned. I let the moment stretch just long enough for it to settle, then stepped back slightly, giving the space back to them. Because the realization was not something I needed to force, it was already doing the work on its own, spreading from one person to the next, carried in the same air that now felt a little less certain than it had the day before. The questions started hitting her all at once, not from me, but from the people standing behind her, voices sharper now, layered with urgency and the kind of frustration that builds when something simple turns complicated without warning. And you could see it in the way Vivian tried to hold her ground, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised, like posture alone could keep control from slipping. "This has to be a mistake," someone said. pacing in a tight line where their car had been, phone pressed to their ear, waiting for an answer that was not coming fast enough. Another voice cut in about towing fees, about legality, about who authorized this, and the air filled with overlapping demands that all pointed in the same direction. Vivian lifted her hand, trying to quiet them, but the noise did not drop the way it used to when she spoke. It hesitated, fractured, like authority had just lost its volume. She turned back to me, eyes sharper now, scanning my face for something she could use, something she could push against. "You are going to reverse this," she said, slower, more controlled, like she was choosing a tone she believed would still carry weight. I shook my head once, not dismissive, just certain, and let a small pause sit between us before I answered. "They can retrieve their vehicles," I said, "from the company listed on that notice." The words were simple, but the effect was not, because now it was not just about what happened, it was about what came next. And you could feel that shift ripple outward as people started checking their phones more urgently, dialing, redialing, stepping away from the group as the reality settled in. Vivian glanced down at the paper again, then back at me, and for a moment her expression tightened in a way that looked less like control and more like calculation. "You cannot enforce private rules on a community improvement," she said, but there was a slight hesitation now, a fraction of a second that had not been there before. I took a step toward the edge of the road and pointed down the length of it, the smooth surface stretching out clean and uninterrupted. "You improved the surface," I said. "You did not acquire the land." The distinction hung there, clear and unmoving, and this time it landed harder because there was nothing abstract about it, nothing vague. One of the neighbors, a man in a work shirt still holding his phone, looked between us and said quietly, "So this is still his property." No one answered him, but no one corrected him either, and that silence did more than any argument could have. Vivian exhaled slowly, the kind of breath people take when they are trying to reset a situation that has already moved past them, and she turned slightly, addressing the group again, but the tone had shifted, less command, more containment. "We will sort this out," she said, but even as she spoke, more people were already walking away, focused on their own problems now, their own vehicles, their own costs, the shared confidence dissolving into individual concern. I stepped back again, giving them space, watching as the structure she had built over the last 2 days started to unravel, not with a dramatic break, but with a series of small, quiet realizations, each one pulling a little more weight away from her until what remained no longer looked like control at all. By mid-morning, the street had settled into something quieter, not calm, not normal, just quieter, like the noise had burned itself out and left behind a kind of uneasy order, and you could see it in the way people moved now. Quicker steps, shorter conversations, phones still in hands as they coordinated rides, called towing companies, tried to piece together a plan for getting their vehicles back. The road itself stayed unchanged, smooth and empty, stretching past houses that suddenly felt a little farther apart without the line of parked cars compressing everything together. And the sign still stood at the entrance, bright and confident, but now it pointed to nothing but open space. I spent most of that time on my porch, not hiding, not engaging, just present, watching the pattern shift from confusion to acceptance, because that is how it always goes when reality replaces assumption. Around 11, a black SUV pulled up near the entrance and parked carefully off to the side, not on the asphalt this time, but just beyond it. Tires resting on gravel like the driver understood something had changed. Vivian stepped out a moment later, sunglasses back on, posture composed again, but not the same as before. Something measured in the way she walked toward me, slower, more deliberate. She stopped a few feet away, the distance no longer filled with certainty, but with something closer to negotiation. "We need to resolve this," she said, voice controlled, stripped of the earlier edge, like she had spent the last few hours recalibrating what power looked like. I nodded once, letting her continue. "The community relied on that access," she added, glancing down the road briefly before returning her focus to me. "We can discuss terms that work for everyone." I let a second pass, then another, not to make a point, but because silence still had work to do here. "Was never community access," I said, calm, steady. "It was always conditional. You just chose to ignore the condition." She exhaled lightly, a small shift that might have been frustration or acceptance, and adjusted her stance. Then set the condition, she said, direct now. Practical, because the situation had moved past denial and into problem solving. I looked past her for a moment, down the length of the road that now carried none of the assumptions it had the day before, then back at her. No unauthorized use, I said, written agreement, defined access, and no alterations without consent. The words were simple, but they carried weight because they were backed by something she had already tested. She considered it, just for a second, then gave a small nod, not agreement yet, but acknowledgement. We will take this to the board, she said, turning slightly as if already shifting into process mode. I stepped back, giving her the space she needed to leave, because the outcome had already been decided long before this conversation started. As she walked away, the neighborhood felt different, not quieter this time but clearer, like the lines that had always existed were finally visible to everyone else. I stood there for a moment longer, looking at that road, the same road I had built, the same ground under a different surface, and I could still remember the sound of that last chain tightening in the dark. The moment everything shifted without a single raised voice. They thought changing the surface changed the rules, but all it really did was expose who understood them in the first place.